Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
I am a 75-year-old who not only has had close encounters with UFOs, but I came face to face with two of the occupants when I was aged 19. Another nutcase, many might remark, if not to my face, rest assured. I have after all no witness to that encounter that took place here in the UK, as my brother Dennis departed these shores to live in Australia in 1969. He would however attest to that which took place 10 years earlier on the first Sunday of January 1959, because he shared that terrifying encounter with me. My family members are fully aware of what my brother Dan and I experienced that traumatic early morning hour, because I have reiterated that account of that mind-blowing experience countless times since. It happened at approximately 200 HRS when Dan and I were en route home along the A3 route from Portsmouth on Dennis's 125cc BSA Bantam motorcycle. He had taken our younger brother, Rob, back to his Royal Marine barracks near Portsmouth. Both Rob and I were serving in the Royal Marines, and our 2 weeks Christmas leave had overlapped one another's by 1 week, his leave commencing 1 week prior to mine. I had taken Rob's railway warrant, which I was entitled to as a fellow Royal Marine, to meet both brothers at Portsmouth and Southsea Railway Station, Dennis having taken Rob there on the pillion of his motorbike. My intention was to say goodbye to Rob at the station and then to return home with Dennis. I had little else to do, and I welcomed the ride and the company. I remember that neither brother was at the station when I arrived there, and I had to wait some time before Den turned up. His motorbike had incurred a front tire puncture, although I have a feeling that I was late arriving at Portsmouth and Southsea Railway Station through some delay or other. When I at last met up with Den, he told me that Rob had continued onward to his barracks, as he had to be there by 3 minutes to midnight. Thus, I mounted the pillion of Den's motorbike well after midnight, and very soon we left Portsmouth far behind. I remember that it was bitter cold, and I clung behind my brother's body to shield myself from that bitter cold air. I wore only a light blue summer jacket and light fawn summer trousers. Aside from my uniform, I possessed a few civilian clothes. Thus we rode along the A3. I was silent, alone with thoughts of my own return to my Royal Marine barracks a week later. Conversing was out of the question. Even shouting loudly was ineffective in the slipstream as we sped along. The whole route was bereft of traffic, and eventually we found ourselves riding around the perimeter of the Devil's Punchbowl at Hindhead. At one point, as we were almost about to leave the bowl behind, so Den suddenly steered the motorbike onto the grass and the engine cut. Problem. Dennis assured me there wasn't a problem, but that it was a good spot to take a breather and to spend a penny. So we stood there on the swat of grass overlooking the deep bowl-shaped valley stretching away before us. The sounds of the wind and of the motorbike engine took several minutes to disperse from our ears, and it was good to get some respite from that bitter cold wind. Then, as the ghost sound of wind and engine dispersed, so we noticed a strange sound emanating from down in the punchbowl itself. A sound impossible to describe, except maybe that it was almost musical to the ears, like the aztec of a submarine, and yet at the same time really nothing like it. We had never heard such a weird sound before, and there was nothing with which to otherwise compare it. Puzzled and exceedingly curious, we elected to make our way down into the punchbowl to discover the source of that mysterious sound. There was an initial very steep slope of maybe 30 feet or so that we were obliged to descend on our backsides. Then, with Den leading the way, we were able to continue on downwards along a barely discernible but more gently descending track. How long we were making our way steadily deeper, I don't know, but we were quite a long way down there, and to me the weird musical sound was becoming ever more mysterious and much louder as we came closer to its source. What's more, as we drew closer to that source, I developed a strong sense of unease that persisted as we proceeded. Soon afterwards, Den stopped abruptly and turned to me to express that he had a bad feeling, and added, "I think we should turn back." Looking back in the direction of whence we had come, I could see that we had in fact traveled an uncomfortable distance away, and in hushed tones I readily agreed with my brother that maybe we should indeed turn back. Literally at that precise moment, before we had even turned around, there came a sudden momentary silence as that weird sound abruptly ceased. What occurred next is equally difficult to describe. There was a sound, almost like that of displaced air. I can explain it no better than that. Then, this sound rose vertically into the air, very close to where we stood. We both dropped to the ground instinctively in an effort to silhouette the object against that brilliant backdrop of stars, but we saw nothing, even though we were able to follow the path of travel by the strange sound it was emitting. It appeared to travel somehow away to our right and then swooped back around to head back towards us. The terrific crash that ensued as it struck the ground was deafening and ought to have been heard as far away as Guildford, my thoughts at that time. It had me comparing it to that of a large airliner crash landing. There then followed the distinct loud sound of scrub being flattened in its path as it seemed to skid along under the inertia of its descent, and then to finally come to a stop some little distance, maybe 20 to 30 feet in front of us. I clearly have, etched into my mind, a distinct memory of the noise of thin branches or scrub scraping along an obviously metallic fuselage, followed by the final scraping sound as that branch broke free. A flying object of some sort had come to a halt. I stood staring at the bushes from where the sound of that crash landing had come. We had seen nothing, and yet this flying object, by the very sound it made as it hit the ground, indicated a large, exceedingly heavy if invisible craft, and in my head the word UFO was at the forefront. Then, almost immediately my attention was drawn to something approaching us from the direction that the UFO had landed. I stared ahead, my mind struggling to believe what was actually taking place. Then it emerged. I will describe what we saw as best to my memory as possible, for I was overcome by a feeling of sheer terror. This figure stood some 8 to 10 feet tall. It appeared to glide rather than to walk. It also appeared to be floating some 2 feet or so off the ground. It stopped in front of me, so close that I could have touched it. I was literally paralyzed with fear, an adrenaline rush so great that it had an opposite effect, and I stood there transfixed, unable to move. Then, a second figure identical to the first glided out from the same direction and stood to the left of the first one, as viewed from my position. Both figures seemed to be floating off the ground and had seemed to glide. The body seemed composed of some sort of black material that was convoluted, with like lengthwise folds. The head was encased in an elongated glass helmet, and where the eyes would be was a single, large round-shaped green eye or light. Today I would liken it to a large light-emitting diode, but I am not so sure such devices existed at that time. Mercifully, I felt I could not see the features behind the glass, but I had an uncanny and distinct feeling that I wouldn't want to see behind the glass anyway. I am unable to clearly describe my feelings except for one thought within the sheer terror that overwhelmed me. This cannot be happening, but it is. Amazingly, thoughts of those in government would not believe what is happening to me right now, but they are fast asleep in their beds and not here in this punchbowl with me, seeing what I am seeing. I clearly recall those thoughts. I seem to remember something else, a sickly odor. Was this the odor of fear, or did it come from those 2 aliens? I truthfully do not know. Such thoughts were fleeting, coming to me in a moment of utmost terror. My second thought was of the sudden need to look at another human being, and almost in slow motion, and with great concentration of effort, I managed to turn my head left to look at my brother. Why left when he had been standing on my right? I'm at a loss to explain that one. The 2 aliens stood a mere few feet away, within touching distance. Utilizing all my concentration, I slowly, so very slowly and mechanically, managed to turn my head to look upon my brother. A second shock now struck me as I saw that I was standing there alone. The shock of this realization galvanized my hitherto paralyzed body into sudden action and turned my body to face the direction that I was facing, for the thought came to me that if I looked back at them again I would not escape. I then ran. That headlong, terror-stricken flight was like a nightmare in itself, because I was expecting to be seized from behind. My thought was that I would surely not be allowed to escape after what I had just witnessed. I had no sense of direction at all. I remember only that my one and only desperate thought was to put as much distance between me and them as possible. I ran, seemingly blindly, and I could plainly hear high-pitched screaming as I ran. Those screams seemed to be apart from me, but may well have come from me. I truly don't know. All I remember was that headlong, panic-stricken flight as running in a nightmare, and the full expectancy that I would not be allowed to escape. The next image as I ran so blindly was of finding myself inexplicably at the base of the 30-foot steep incline that we had initially descended. How did I, in that panic-stricken flight, manage to find my way back to where we had descended into the Punchbowl? I was unable to explain that one either. There, ahead of me and scrambling up that steep incline, was my brother. I had caught up with him, and in later years he told me that he was on a rise before reaching that incline, and that when he looked back to check that I was with him, he saw to his horror that I was still standing at the original spot with 2 aliens clearly seen towering over me. By the time he had scaled that steep incline, I had caught him up. He must have seen me but seconds before I had turned and fled. As a very fit, young Royal Marine, and at the same time fueled with sheer panic, I can answer that one quite clearly. As we feverishly tried to climb that steep incline so we would slip back down a foot for every 3 we made upwards. Eventually we made the top. Den mounted his motorbike, kick-started it, and I leapt onto the pillion, and away we sped in great haste. Even as we rode at speed along that road, I was half expecting to be seized and pulled off that motorbike, and I clung tenaciously, my arms around my brother's waist. I remember that just before we reached the city of Guildford, 11 miles on, Den pulled over and cut the engine. A tall, long ash fence lay close to us, and against this we dropped onto our haunches, unable to believe what had happened and how we had escaped a fate worse than death. I remember nothing more after collapsing against that fence. I have in memory of arriving home, not even of the rest of my leave. I do not to this day remember returning to my barracks nor of the intense training that followed. I have hitherto told no one outside of the family of our experience at the Punchbowl that never-to-be-forgotten night. Strangely, I never forgave my brother for deserting me down there. For 3 years I had no contact with him. Then, I heard that my brother was in an isolation hospital at Feltham, where he lived, and that he was in a serious condition. Dennis had contracted hepatitis C, and relenting, I went to visit him. What I saw shocked me and totally melted my anger. Den looked like a skeleton with yellow skin drawn over it. He was badly jaundiced and had almost died. A priest had closed his eyes when Den suddenly opened them, and the nurse had screamed. It had been a very close call. It was years later that Den explained that he had thought I was behind him when he ran. Only on reaching high ground had he turned to look back and saw that I was not with him but was standing there still with those two beings towering over me. His only thought then was to escape and to report what had happened. Luckily for me, I managed to just catch him up before he'd gained the top of that steep incline, above which his motorbike was parked. It was all of a 30 miles journey back to where I lived. Besides, poor Den would no doubt have been taken for psychiatric observation, or charged with possible murder associated with my disappearance. Do I believe in aliens? Do I what? Oh yes, they exist for sure. You won't find them when you are in the pub, watching TV, or fast asleep in your bed, although I must hesitate here because I have since read of abductions of hitherto sleeping persons. There was something else that is relevant to this true story. When I finally talked with Dennis and asked him outright,
"Why did you desert me down there?" It was those small creatures with red eyes that had almost formed a circle around you. There were hundreds of them. I never thought I would see you again.
I had not seen these red-eyed creatures, but then I had not been looking back. Many years later, on desolate Dartmoor in Devonshire, late one night, on the northern moor out of Oakhampton, was a strange arc of brilliant white light. Another brother, Jim, and his teenage son and daughter were with us. We decided to look closer at this strange arc of bright white light behind a high rocky tor. The road to that part of the moor was narrow, too narrow to reverse turn, and so would necessitate continuing a few miles further to the tiny roundabout or donut to come back on our own. After driving along this narrow road, flanked on either side by a steep drop onto a boulder-strewn moor for some miles, I began to feel a strong sense of apprehension, a strange feeling of danger, my sixth sense at work. This feeling had barely been with me for long when Brother Jim suggested that we should turn back because he felt it was dangerous to continue. However, I had spotted something else, something that made my heart race. I saw literally hundreds if not thousands of pairs of red eyes. Those red eyes did not belong to animals because no animal was capable of such speed and able to traverse that boulder-strewn terrain and the deep craters littering the North Moor, especially at night, besides which the number of those pairs of red eyes was vast. My blood ran cold as I remembered what Den had seen at the Punchbowl, red eyes exactly what we were seeing there now on that moor. And without doubt were seeking to surround us. Keeping my mounting panic and concern to myself, I heard Jim again express his concern at continuing, and I responded with mounting anger due to fear and frustration that I could not bloody well turn around as the road was far too narrow and too high above the moor for the wheels to reach the ground once the wheels left the road. I felt that we had no choice but to continue on to that small roundabout or donut that I estimated was about 4 miles further on. I was driving a MK 1601 Ford Consul, and Brother Jim asked to get out to see if there was a place we could do a reverse turn. All too soon he called out,
"Here, Brian, you can reverse here."
I replied, "Are you sure, Jim?" I had doubts, and that the drop appeared to be too deep. He assured me that it was okay. The rapidly moving red eyes had by now spread out ahead of us, crossed over the road, and having split into two vast groups either side of that road, both were rushing speedily in our direction as if to encircle us. Where had I heard this before? It was Dennis and the Punchbowl saga all over again. Thousands of them it seemed to me to be. Now I knew it was vital that we escaped. The memory of the Punchbowl left little doubt in my mind as to what those red eyes were, what they belonged to. Trying hard to control the fast-rising panic within me, I shakily expressed my doubts that the drop was too deep and would plant the car on its chassis before the wheels contacted the ground. "No, it's okay." Jim's words were hardly convincing, but by now close to panic myself, I drove slowly, turning the steering wheel hard over to greatly affect the reverse turn, and trusting Jim's observation, I put the gear into reverse and backed the car slowly off the road. A sudden crash ensued and the wheels, it was rear-wheel drive, spun above the surface of the ground. We were now completely trapped and helpless. Jim and Jimmy got out of the car and went to the rear. Christine was sitting behind me as her dad and brother were trying to lift the car back onto the road, without success. I had seldom experienced such fear as I sat there helplessly watching those rapidly speeding entities that would soon have encircled and been upon us. No one else in my car had yet seen them. Jim and his son were trying to lift the rear of that 1600cc Ford console back onto the road. Jim was a brawny, a strong fellow, but all that he and his son achieved was to lift the car only so far, a little way off its suspension. The wheels, however, remained firmly on the ground. The idea fleetingly entered my head to get out and to run those 9 miles back to Oakhampton, but how when those things were so fleetingly fast? Besides which, I couldn't leave Christine, and whatever happened, we were not capable of traveling 9 miles on foot to escape those rapidly speeding beings. Then, as Jim was trying without success to lift the car, Christine suddenly glanced over to her right, saw the hundreds of red eyes pouring like a flood down that sloping terrain towards us, screamed loudly, "What are those? What are those?" Her loud scream signaled for the movement of the car on its springs to momentarily cease. Obviously, Jim had paused to see what had frightened his daughter. This was then followed by the sudden and unbelievable lifting of the car bodily in such a way as to slew it around at the same time so that it was facing our escape route out of there. Jim and Jimmy dived into the car and opened the throttle. I drove out of that place like the proverbial bat out of hell. I could scarcely believe our lucky escape. It is said that fear can induce enormous reserves of strength in a crisis, and that is what happened with Jim. I drove as fast as was safely possible on that narrow road that night, and upon reaching the top of a hill, some mile or two further on, I stopped the car, engine left running, got out and looked back, Jim likewise. For several seconds we saw nothing, but then, there they were, those 2 vast swarms of red eyes pursuing us, on both sides of that road. I don't exaggerate their numbers, to me that seemed to run in hundreds if not thousands. They appeared to me to be small in stature, that was my impression because it was dark. They certainly traveled at speed over a very dangerous and rough terrain with many deep craters and strewn boulders. After about 5 stops, atop a hill, a precaution in the event that the car stalled and would not restart, we would coast down. Each time we stopped and looked back so a minute or so would pass, then suddenly, there they were, continuing their pursuit of us. On the last hill I was able to see the lights of Oakhampton ahead of us, on our right. We stopped here and again looked back. This time, however, we saw nothing more of those red-eyed creatures. Whether you believe my true narrative I leave with you. I can but sincerely express that it happened as I have recorded it. As a reluctant ufologist, I have written of this alien encounter quite some time ago. It was not published on the site I sent it to, neither was it even acknowledged. I wrote it out of sincere interest and possibly in the hope of eliciting a similar experience from others who may be experiencing an extraterrestrial identical to mine. For what it's worth, I have made pilgrimage to that same area several times since, without success except for 2 occasions when I heard that same musical sound fly over not so far overhead, just above tree height in fact. Nothing was visible, although the sound indicated it had passed over the top of the tall pine trees through which our path led. My car, that I borrowed from my younger brother, was parked some half-mile away at a car park off the A3, and unable to contain my excitement as my brother said to me,
Brian, I have never doubted your story, but hearing that sound for myself, well, it is certainly not of this world.
I suggested we return to the car, have a much-needed coffee to steady our nerves, grab the portable excuse for a tape recorder, a tiny Woolworth job, and endeavor to capture that weird sound. We made it to the car park and to the coffee when suddenly brilliant lights lit up the car from behind. A tap on the window and I saw a policeman accompanied by a special. I wound the window down. He asked, "What are you doing here?" My short fuse at this offensive intrusion, along with my irate words to the effect that it was a free country, and to clear off. Well, clear was not exactly the word I used. It did not go down well because a second patrol car arrived and my brother and I were handcuffed and incarcerated in separate cells at Godalming Police Station. How could we explain that we were UFO hunting? The police cells that we spent 6 hours in being infinitely the better alternative to a mental hospital. This incarceration was due to the copper opening the boot of the car and discovering a 12-bore shotgun that I had placed there, intending to shoot rabbits the following morning. I was accused of being Harry Roberts, the guy who had shot a policeman dead, although this man was already in police custody in 1966. Raymond and I were released at 600 hours the following morning, without charge. I have had other experiences of UFOs, one of which was no rest distance away out at sea off Brighton in Sussex. It made no sound, gave the undoubted impression of being immense in size, and moved slowly and silently just above the sea, emerging from a fog bank on the west side to vanish silently into the fog bank on the east side. It was followed then by a second, identical saucer-shaped UFO with a beehive-like dome on top and small portholes around the circumference of the body. Time being 500 hours. I had been sea fishing at the time of the occurrence. I also had a frightening experience whilst under canvas at that same seaside resort of Brighton. But that, as they say, is another story.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.